My name is Matt Hoffman. I'm a partner. I'm the head of talent at M13, a venture firm based out of Los Angeles and New York. I'm thrilled to be joined by three of my friends and three amazing coaches, Jonathan Raymond, Jonathan Basker, and Rachel Ryder. So I'm going to say a bit about each of them, and then we'll get right into it. And again, just a reminder for those who are joining us, if you do have questions at any point, please put them in the chat window. We really want this discussion to be as interactive as possible. So going from left to right, at least on my screen, Jonathan Raymond is the founder and the CEO of Refound, based out of San Diego. He's the author of Good Authority, and he's got over 15 years of experience advising founders, CEOs, and managers on how to have performance conversations that connect business objectives to personal growth. Jonathan, thank you for being a part of this.
Hey, man, thanks for inviting me.
Jonathan Basker, known as Basker to distinguish between the two Jonathans on the call today. Jonathan Basker has spent his career becoming an expert in how humans operate and how they cooperate inside of early stage companies. He's worked with organizations like Etsy, BarkBox, Handy, Envision, and BetaWorks, helping them cultivate their talent and culture. He was one of the first people to hold a talent partner type role within Venture. That's pretty cool. And he developed a hacker in residence model for the VC studio system. And then finally, Rachel Ryder, who is the founder of MetaWorks. She's an executive coach with certification from Columbia and complements that training with somatic experience practitioner experience. She has over a decade of experience in the HR professional world, including business partner work and coaching work at organizations like Bloomberg, AppNexus, and DigitalOcean, which I've heard great things about. So thank you all for joining. I really appreciate it. Starting off, so we're talking about focus and resilience at a time of stress and anxiety, and that's probably the understatement of the year, right? The world that we're living in is incredibly fraught with tension, with anxiety, with stress. People are worried about job security. They're worried about health security, food security. The amount of anxiety that any person under the best of circumstances is dealing with is unprecedented, and companies are at that precipice too. And yet, despite that being the case, organizations need to get the best out of their people, right? There's a time where the difference between quite literal life and death, for at least for an organization, is real, right? So amongst that stress, companies need to ask for more out of their teams, more of their employees than ever. And yet it's harder for employees to perform their best given everything that's going on externally. So acknowledging that every company is different, every company is going through their own version of the trials that they need to face. I'm curious for all of you to talk about, for the first part of this session, how leaders set a baseline for success and how they create healthy, performative goals for their team under those conditions. So Rachel, I want to start with you. Given those things being true, from your experience or what you see, what is the most important thing that leaders and managers can do to help their teams focus right now in these circumstances?
I think the first major fundamental piece of this is coming back to the why. Why are we doing what we're doing as an organization? What's our mission? What's the point of the work? What are we trying to accomplish? As a team, what's our mission? What's our point of our work? What are we trying to accomplish? And as an individual, why am I showing up every day? Why does this matter to me? How does that help inform my priorities? All of these questions help in that prioritization exercise right now, because there's so much being pulled at us from many different directions. So I would strongly suggest to start with the why as a foundational place and a point of reference.
Basker, from your perspective, what do employees also most need to hear? How do the leaders create the organizational conditions to drive that performance, to drive that success, to answer some of the questions that Rachel raised?
I had a call with the client just this morning, and one of the things we did was to separate out the distinction between the operational needs and the organizational needs that he was seeing right now, to recognize that they're symbiotic. I mean, they're incredibly interwoven, but they are separate. So lack of clarity on either would be harmful or dangerous, and certainly would feel unpleasant, and lack of clarity on both even more so. So I would encourage leaders in startups, especially where there's already a lot of anxiety, there's already a lot of uncertainty, there's already a lot of thrash and a lot of movement, to take a step back right now, get as clear as you can about what's going on. I mean, I think in a moment like this, the hardest and healthiest thing is to get to the truth of things, even if it's not pleasant, or maybe it's more pleasant than you think. But anxiety tends to provoke avoidance, and avoidance tends to provoke some version of a fight, flight, or freeze. And that's going to be seen both systemically, organizationally, operationally, and individually. So when you ask the question about what people or what managers and leaders can do for the individuals in the company, I would say give them as much clarity as possible, because clarity is the antidote to anxiety. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Anxiety seeks certainty. But that's just a baseline. After that, I think everything is could almost, I don't want to overdub it down, but like, just be human. This is a weird moment, and everyone's having a different reaction to it. This person's having one. It's pretty discoverable. Matt, how's COVID going for you? What's hard? What's nice? How are your kids? How can I help you? It's just as simple as genuinely engaging. And maybe to close this, in order to do that, you're going to have to engage with yourself so that you're healthy enough to be able to show up for your people.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Before we officially started, we were asking each other exactly that. How are you doing? And Raymond answered, I'm doing well, right? COVID well. And I think just that acknowledgement, right, which we all loved as a great answer, because it acknowledges that in this moment, this is not a normal moment, right? And even in the best of circumstances, there are things going on that we have to pay attention to and that we have to acknowledge. And that doesn't mean that you can't ask of other people in your team. That doesn't mean that you can't drive from other people in the team, but you do have to have that human connection, saying everyone is going through this unique moment in history and in their own personal situations. And how do you do that? So Jonathan, from your perspective, what other conversations do most need to happen? And what does accountability look like under the most uncertain of circumstances, where it is hard to predict the future and everyone does have something else going on? How do you drive accountability and performance in a way while still acknowledging that the world is completely different for most people and teams?
I suspect we'll be doing, certainly I will be, and I think Rachel, probably Jonathan Basker as well, we'll be talking a lot about things that were true before COVID-19 and are more true now. And I think that's, my first response would be the acknowledging the reality that we're in. So if you were struggling as an organization, like most organizations were struggling with how to up-level the skills and abilities and capacities of leaders and managers pre-COVID, right? Before people working from home, before 10x more uncertainty than there is now, there's 10x more uncertainty. The first place to start is actually to think about what's realistic for this person in this role. And so much of what was in the closet before needs a fresh look. It's like, wait, is that actually still important? Can we actually work on that? Is it realistic to think that this team, which let's say this team used to have 10 people on it, now it has 7 because we did a reduction in force, and now everybody's working from home, and now this person has 3 kids that they're trying to take care of while they're working. Is it realistic that they're going to be able to accomplish the same things that they were before? No. Okay. So how do we deal with that? And so those conversations with people, to dovetail with what Basker was saying about just being human and open and saying, hey, here's what it looked like before COVID. Well, that's probably wrong under the current circumstances. Let's talk about how it's wrong. And if we can get in conversation of how it's wrong, well, then we can figure out a new right, and then we can collaborate. And the mistake that managers and leaders make is they think, okay, well, I still have to drive performance, and they just keep driving on the same and the same goals and the same objectives in an entirely different reality. And then you sound, because you are completely tone deaf to the world that most people live in.
And I would, in addition to what Jonathan's saying, I would add, I completely agree with the conversation here, and that's precisely why it's so helpful to start talking about the why and the prioritization. Because if a manager is saying, we got to drive to these deliverables, get it done, but doesn't empower the employee to triage and prioritize in that moment when they are homeschooling 3 kids and managing dinner and etc., that at least if the employee understands the why, it helps inform how they themselves can prioritize the goals to get done in the moment. And I think that's an important communication.
What I appreciated earlier is when we said, things that were true before are even more true now in this heightened time. And one of the things that we know is just a proven way of driving performance is setting really good, useful, focused goals to drive the performance, whether it looks like organization OKRs or individual goals. Having those objectives helps focus and prioritize. And that's even more true now, but as we're all saying, there's so much more going on. And in many cases, teams have to do even more things because of the environment with potentially fewer resources. And it's typical that a lot of those priorities get diluted because now there's more to do and everything is urgent. So I'm curious for all of you, how do you help set frameworks to drive prioritization, to drive that focus? How do you help leaders do those? What should they be doing to focus on the most important things right now?
So there's a metaphor that I keep in the front of my mind right now, or really just a story. Post 9/11, there was an opportunity for meteorologists to study something that they were never otherwise going to get a chance to see, which is what happens when there's no planes in the air. And there'd long been a theory that the exhaust and emissions from commercial airlines were basically changing weather patterns. And they were able to confirm it for about the week after this. Similarly, I feel like right now, this massive shift, just to sort of add on Jonathan's point, has created this opportunity not only to acknowledge that maybe things weren't perfect before, but to actually just feel it in a different way and see it in a different way. And so if you're feeling a breakage, again, to Jonathan's point, it probably existed beforehand, but also you may have an opportunity to feel it more acutely and more simply. So I would say, or what I do say is, decide who's on your team right now. Who do you really trust? No bullshit. Like, who's on your real executive team right now? Gather those people. Get their insight and their opinions. Ask them to go to their people and get the appropriate level of insight and opinion. And include an assessment of the air traffic right now that it's changed, now that it's different. How's information moving or not moving? Be forensic. This is about actually going and looking at a project. Where did it break? Where did it get stuck? Did it? Where it's healthy? What's not? And then just rebuild an operating manual V1 for the next X number of months for the reality of COVID. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a lot of work. And without that time investment, I don't think it'll do much. But I know it sounds simple, but I think it can yield big results to just go back to the drawing board and say, what do we need to shift? What can we let go of? What do we need to strengthen? And then to articulate it, write it down, get everyone to buy in, and then communicate that out to the company. And that's just your V1, and then you iterate from there.
Rachel, are there any other frameworks that you use to help drive prioritization for teams?
Yeah, I love that metaphor, Tasker. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, there's particularly in this point in time, I like to bring leaders' attention to what is within their control and what is not. It's such an important distinction to make, because often we can spend a lot of time spinning about things that are out of our control instead of identifying what's out of our control and plan around it, or then focus on what is in our control. Within what is in our control, it's really important to now, I love what Bhaskar said, is this an opportunity? So many of the leaders that I work with, whether you're founders or CPOs or CTOs, are constantly saying, I want to get out of the weeds more, or I have too much on my plate, or that they want to be more visionary leaders. Well, now's the time, because we can't possibly do everything, and there's a lot of constraints. And so within what's within our control, it's really important as a leader to identify, who have I been trying to be for a really long time and haven't had the opportunity to? How can that show up now? How do I play within these restraints as opportunities? And that's the place we start.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We were having a conversation with one of the CEOs in our portfolio, and he's such a visionary CEO, and he's talking about all these great visionary things that he wants to do and does in fact need to do to build the organization. But at the same time, it's like you also need to block and tackle and execute just to get through the end of the year, right? So making sure you're focused on the things that you can do to set that up is so critical. I want to, we got an amazing question from someone in the audience that I want to acknowledge, and I want to encourage other people to do this as well. So we had a question from Dan asking about the distinction between wartime, peacetime CEOs, which I think is a Ben Horowitz metaphor. And then how do you balance individual situations with organizational goals? So how do you focus on the individual short-term things that need to happen weekly, monthly as priority shifts, while keeping in mind some of those long-term priorities? How can CEOs do that for those other perspectives?
I'll take the second part of it first, in that, and I think it ties to your question before about how do we think about goals, whether they're team goals or individual goals. There's a question that can drive some productive conversation, which is what would need to be true, right? So if you have a goal from before and now the situation's changing, the team went from 10 people to 7 people, or maybe the team went from 10 people to 18 people. Maybe there's an organization that's seeing a surge in demand, as many companies are right now. Asking the question on the part of the manager or a CEO, hey, here's what we were trying to do. Here's the vision that I had. Here's what I was hoping for. In the current circumstances, what would need to be true for us to reach that goal? Now you're engaging the critical thinking powers and the creative powers of the team, the people on the team, and then you release yourself as a manager and leader to do what you do really well, which is to remove roadblocks, to solve problems, to think creatively. You can then take the results of those conversations and say, hey, I went and talked with my team, and I asked them what would need to be true in order to do that. And they said, well, we need more of this, less of that, and 7, scoops of that. Okay, great. Well, let me see if I can go get that. Let me see if I can go do that. And maybe it's trading with other managers inside the organization. But opening up the conversation, not demanding, hey, before the goal was this, let's keep pushing forward. And then inside of that, now you got to talk to each individual and see their individual situation. And it comes down to a conversation, right? And sometimes people will be really open and honest with you about, hey, I'm really struggling with X, Y, and Z. Sometimes you're going to have to use your power of intuition and sense, hey, something's a little bit off and I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm going to ask them a question, and something simple, right? Just a lot of the conversation methodology that we teach around just opening that conversation. Hey, since we've been working remotely, here's what I'm sensing, is that true? What's your reality? And then that person is very likely to open up and talk to you about what they're seeing and share with you their individual circumstances. And then you can help, right? So you're not treating everybody equally, but you're treating those individual human beings as individual human beings. And then you kind of layer it up to, okay, well, what do I need to change, if anything, on the overall team?
I mean, I can respond to the first part of that question. First of all, if you're a CEO of a startup, it's always wartime. I mean, yes, this is a tremendously insane moment globally, but if you are either pre-product market fit and searching for it on a diminishing runway where your money's running out every day and you're not sure that someone will give you more, or you're post-product market fit and you're trying to hang on to your hat while you grow way faster than you ever knew how to do, none of those sound very peaceful to me. I don't think peace is a word that you hear as often as actually I'd like in the world of startups. But I reject the paradigm. I mean, I remember I haven't read it in a while, but I remember the blog post, and I think the point was, shit just got real, so you better get real right along with it. That was sort of the energy of it, if I remember right. I don't think that's what is needed right now. I think we've all said this a couple of different ways, but I'll just reiterate my version of it. I don't think much changed for most organizations when COVID came along. And it's a bit of a controversial statement, but your business is still your business. Temporarily, your market has shifted on you drastically. Your ability to raise capital may have shifted, and your personal levels of anxiety or happiness, et cetera, and those around you, they all may have changed dramatically. But those are conditions that change in any normal set of circumstances in a startup ecosystem. These were always skills that you were going to have to figure out. This kind of adaptability and robustness and resourcefulness was always going to be something that you were going to need in order to get where you want to go if your ambitions are high. So I don't think there's anything out of the wartime playbook that you wouldn't need along the way. I don't think there's anything out of the peacetime playbook that you wouldn't need along the way.
I think what's really interesting is, and I think we can all resonate with this as people leaders, to me, the wartime, peacetime distinction has always been, in peacetime, you lavish your employees with perks. It's all about growth. In wartime, everything kind of gets lean and mean, right? And what's interesting is it is definitely true that a lot of budgets are going to be tighter in this time. But what I've been seeing in people I'm talking to and leaders is that, you probably don't need the ping pong table right now. And maybe the catered lunch and buffet style isn't going to work in the near future. But taking care of employees is actually more important than ever, right? And paying attention to the mental and emotional and physical needs of your employees is more critical than ever, and every company is doing that. So I think the way you frame the distinction is really helpful. It's not just about kind of soft and cushy versus lean and mean. It's around focusing on the external threats in the marketplace and doing so in a way where you drive the growth. And I think that is always the case, and that will continue to be the case going forward.
Matt, if I can just say one thing about that,
Yeah.
in working through with a lot of companies around kind of layoffs and how they're doing, what I've been saying to people is, look, pre-COVID, you knew that your managers and leaders needed more support, and you had a budget for that. If you're going through your cuts, and at the end result of your cuts, you've lost whatever supporting, whatever budget you had for coaching and development, you didn't cut deep enough. If you don't have any money left over to support the leaders and managers that are sticking around in some meaningful way, you didn't cut deep enough. And that's not the thing that should be the casualty during this time. And, I think people are realizing, hey, we can't lose in the wartime. If we, that strained metaphor, I agree, it's not my favorite analogy, but the support is more now for employees, but also for the managers and leaders. Oftentimes they may be leading from home for the first time, remotely for the first time. They're certainly their first time leading through a pandemic, right? They need help.
It's harder right now.
Help.
It's not easier. It's not less important.
Exactly.
It's actually harder and more critical. So it's a perfect segue to what I want to talk about. And it's similar to what we were talking about earlier. With the crisis comes a corresponding opportunity, right? And how do we use COVID to create that opportunity? So one of the things they had mentioned, Jonathan, is around how do you help managers get better? How do you help them create more vulnerability, create more empathy, get better at managing under circumstances that they hadn't done before? So are there things we've learned now about best leadership practices that we didn't know before? How do we use that new knowledge in the new situation going forward to drive better leadership practices and management practices in precisely the way that we say?
So there are many answers, but I'm just going to start with one, which is what I've seen in so many of the leaders and managers I've talked with recently is that they are doing vulnerability without thinking about it. And they're realizing, they're going like, oh, that wasn't so bad after all, right? So they're actually having so many more real, honest, open, human conversations, all the things like the three of us have been telling people to do forever. They're just doing it because they're like, the exigency of the moment requires them to do it. And then they're like, oh, that was actually pretty good. And so I think like everyone's been trying to convince leaders and managers to be more vulnerable, and that's going to be this virtuous cycle of good things. And people are sort of doing it, and they're like, hey, that kind of works. So that's, I would say, like, if you're having that experience, I can actually just talk to people, do more of that. That would be my first answer.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to not have that level of vulnerability when you're taking calls from your home in your pajama pants, and you're like me, and you're 3 feet high in Lego and building blocks, right? So right. I think everyone kind of creates that level of vulnerability, whether you want to or not. It's now, how do you use it to your advantage? So Rachel, I'm actually curious your perspective on that. What does empathy look like now, where performance is more critical than ever? How do you balance that and still recognize these type of connections?
Yeah, I was just thinking of a helpful formula, because I can imagine that sometimes the use of the term vulnerability isn't intuitively obvious as leaders. What does that mean? How does that show up? And I think it often is, you could think of it as a formula of sharing one's own experience, my own experience, and then asking an open-ended question. So, wow, I'm finding it pretty nice to be home with my son. I get to see him a lot, but whew, there's a lot more to carry, and we're like passing the boy off between meetings. How is it going for you? How are you finding you're being able to get your work done? Knowing the goal that we have set, how are you finding you're able to do it? Let's talk about where you're carving out time. Where is that becoming a struggle? Where is the timeline going to work with you, and how's that going to be an issue? How have your hours needed to change as a result? So really sharing our own personal experience, maybe offering an observation and then asking open-ended questions, actually makes a huge difference in fostering a deeper level of conversation. And I wanted to acknowledge in the conversation we were talking about earlier about identifying goals and still honoring our people, that the more, just like Bhaskar and Jonathan are talking about, being vulnerable, having real talk, The more we do that with our employees, the more invested and deeply loyal they will be to us, and actually the higher they will perform. So when we see there isn't a performance issue right now, let's get really curious as leaders. Hey, what's going on? What are the constraints you're finding? What parts of this goal are really getting in the way? Let's ruthlessly prioritize within this goal so that we can make sure you're getting what you need and the company is still meeting what it needs.
There's two quick points I desire to throw in here. The first is, if someone was performing fine before all of this and now they're struggling, at least you've got a diagnosis. This is a temporary, unusual situation and set of circumstances, and for whatever reason in this moment it's affecting them in a way that makes it hard for them to do their job. That's what you have on your hands. So before you go firing that person, remember they were doing great up until about mid-March. Two, I would say, and this is one of the few times where I just straight up give advice as opposed to the kind of coaching that has a non-advising quality.
And this is a one where you, like, this is a time for advice, right?
So my advice, I would beg you, let go of expectations and pick up anticipations and support, and to be less quippy about that. What I mean is an expectation is this can only go one way and the other way is wrong. And so there's some quote out there that says something like expectations are just premeditated disappointments. So if you already have this rigid, like it has to go this way or else something went wrong, and now I'm going to give that to you and you better be perfect or else you're in trouble. And I would say this outside of the context of COVID. That tends to cause problems in organizations, and especially in the dynamic of manager to employee, because the power dynamic's not fair. So it doesn't feel fair, and we all seek fairness, sort of a core need for most of us. But when you instead anticipate, how is I'm talking about me, Jonathan. How is Jonathan doing this week? Wow, he's killing it. I think I can give this to him, give him a little bit of kudos, and he's gonna take it home. Versus, I know he's struggling right now. What is he gonna need from me, from others? Is that reasonable? Are there hard conversations I need to have with him up front, saying, hey, I know this has been hard for you, but I also need to know that this is gonna get done. And I'm gonna be looking at this. Like, I'm expecting, I know I just broke my own rule, but still, like, I'm being really clear by anticipating ahead. And communicating with that person, like, here's where we are, and how can I help you? And there's the support part. Without that, it's half a tool. But when you really stop and let go of this, like, I have expectations, I'm in charge, I need to be right, everyone else needs to just get their fucking shit together, it's go, wartime CEO. Fuck that. Instead, what you can do is put on a very mature, sensible hat and say, what's going on? What do I think might happen? And how do I make sure that what actually happens is the most positive output and outcome possible, both for the team and for the business, and for the individuals that are a part of that.
That's great.
It's important.
Matt, if I could just, I just wanted to put in the space one thing that, we do a lot of work with organizations that have a mix between office workers and factory frontline, a lot of like highly technical folks. And one of the things that I think it's, for me anyway, is worth naming is that this conversation we're having is a luxury in a lot of organizations, that a lot of, this being able to have conversations and maybe adding a little bit more vulnerability and talking to people about their well-being, that's rarefied air in our economy right now. And there's a lot of people who are under pressure that the people on this call cannot even imagine. And I just wanted to name that, not that we can solve for that, but more as a call to, like, if we can't do this in the privileged office, hey, we can work from home, we're getting boxes delivered. Like, if we can't do that, then forget it, right? So if you want to change the world, start in your own organization, start with the people you're working with, and acknowledge and remember that, 90, maybe it's 99% of the people have nothing even remotely resembling a manager who's investing in their well-being right now.
What is the advice and counsel that you give leaders with organizations and workforces like that? How do you help them drive performance and still kind of create the environment that we're talking about?
We're working with a lot of organizations just to ask more questions. Hey, especially with bringing people back on site. Hey, this is a decision we're making. We feel like it's safe. Here's the guidelines that we've put in place. Does that work for you? If not, what needs to change about it? Do you want, offering more flexibility in terms of PTO? Some people who maybe they have an elderly parent at home. Hey, I'd like to stay home for a couple more weeks, or can there be some other accommodation? And bringing managers, those frontline managers, into the conversation and letting them know, hey, we want to know what is it that people need to make this be okay or okay enough under the circumstances, because the frontline managers, they're generally going to be like, I just got to get this stuff done, and they don't really care. And so actually demonstrating and engaging that we really do care. We really want to know, hey, in our next one-on-one, can you come back to me with 3 things you've heard from
Yeah.
folks on the front line that we could do to make it a little bit easier for them right now?
I think that's right.
That level of engagement.
One of the things that we're all talking about is just the power of the conversation, right? And the power of bringing curiosity and listening rather than just directing. And that looks really different when you're dealing with white collar, remote technical workers and when you're dealing with people on the ground. But the opportunity for conversation and empowerment is still there, right? And we know, regardless of the situation, some of the best innovations come from people who are on the ground. And the more that you feel comfortable giving them some level of autonomy and control, whether it's physical safety, whether it's emotional or psychological safety, and certainly in this environment, physical safety is key, around creating your own environment, those are things you can do to help drive performance. And it feels a lot harder to give that level of autonomy up to those type of workers you're talking about, but it's actually even more critical because those quite honestly, quite literally are the essential workers right now. So what can you do to kind of involve them in that conversation in the way you're talking about? I think is so critical. I want to open it up to audience questions one more time and offer an opportunity to please ask those. The last question that I will ask at the panels is around kind of where we go from here. What do next steps look like in this new world, as temporary or as permanent as it may be? What does high performance look like now? What does it look like to you? What does it look like leaders? How do we measure high performance? How do we cultivate high performance? What are the key things that leaders need to take away from this going forward? I'll answer.
You cut out there, Matt. Who were you calling on?
Whoever wants to answer. When you think about high performance in the future, measuring, creating it, driving it, what does that look like in the new world?
Oh, I'm happy to jump in. So, for us, there's one core tool that we teach. It's called the accountability dial. And it really comes down to engaging with people in real talk about where they are and what they're doing. And I think that the environment, I was just talking with our PR firm, and we're doing some repositioning around the world of COVID. And, basically the consensus is like, look, COVID is accelerating a bunch of trends that were already there before. And so there's a lot of organizations. There was an article yesterday, hey, a lot of people are working from home and they're thinking like, maybe that's not so bad, right? Maybe I kind of like that. And maybe that's going to be more a feature, and commercial real estate is expensive. And maybe we don't need a $300,000 a month office or whatever it is, or 50,000. And what I would say is that environment is an environment of fewer and sort of lower fidelity visual cues when you're not in an office. I'm specifically talking about working from home. You don't have the context interactions. There's a lot of good data out there. Right now, when we're talking on Zoom, we're not making eye contact with one another because if I look at the camera, I'm looking up there, not looking at you. I can't see your body language. You're sitting in a kind of controlled box. There's a lot of information that I'm missing. And so that levels up the need for conversation, feedback, open-ended questions, dialogue. And I think that's an acceleration of, any chief people officer or passionate culture CEO has already been talking about this for the last 18 months to 2 years. And it's just what you were doing before, do more of it, keep your eyes on that. It's more important than it was before. Some of the vagaries of the situation are different, but the conversation that we as a performance-y world started 3 years ago, it's same conversation, more, better, more human, more vulnerable, keep going.
Yeah, there was a really interesting article, and by interesting, I mean terrifying, in the New York Times today about how companies are looking to measure productivity in a remote environment. For those of you who haven't read it, we can send it as a link. It's a good example of what not to do for organizations in terms of measuring activity versus measuring output and equating that level of productivity with performant productivity. Rachel and Bhaskar, for you, what does performance look like, and how do leaders measure and cultivate that?
I can go if you want, Oscar. 2 things come to mind. I mean, I think there's just a clear theme, as Jonathan just said, is bringing your humanity to work at a new level, and really fostering interpersonal connection and in doing so, I think there's a level of autonomy in asking people to think about how they want to show up at work and how they want to deliver their goals, where the workday looks a little different because there's many other demands. So I think there's a piece about bringing humanity, fostering human connection, and also ruthless prioritization and clarity and communication of that message. The clearer the goals are for the organization, the team, and the individual, the better people will perform, the better they will understand how they should get work done, what work matters, and how they should manage their time to do so. So I think you need both more humanity and clear prioritization and communication across the company.
It's funny. I imagine if you go and ask a bunch of people for you know, a laundry list of the things that they think are included in the future of work, when you frame it that way, I think what you tend to get an incredibly thoughtful and articulate laundry list of what was bleeding edge thinking within the last 2 to 10 years. Just to support what I hear both Jonathan and Rachel saying, is I don't think there's like new things to be discovered. I think we already know what the trends are and where we might need to go. And I hope and I appreciate that as terrible as this moment is, it may accelerate us to some really positive things. But the other thing I'll say is, I don't think the future of work is determined by the workplace. I think it's determined by the people and their lives outside of the workplace and what our expectations for work are. If you look at how work was supposed to fit into your life in America in the 1930s, it looked very different than the 1950s, looked different than the 1970s, looks different than today. And that the expectations that drive what work is in your life, it may not sound obvious, but I think they're one of the biggest determining factors for what the future of work looks like. Specifically on performance, what I'm guessing is going to happen after COVID, and this is wild speculation, is that many of us, whether it was pleasant or unpleasant, stressful or restful, I didn't mean to rhyme, most of us are going to have had a taste of a very different experience and got popped out of our bubble and got popped out of our regular rhythm, and we're reminded that we're living a life and it's moving. And I think most people are going to come back to work as a little bit more open and are going to have an expectation for those of us in yuppie territory, because to Jonathan's point, not everyone's going to have this luxury. But for those of us that are going to, we're going to come back wanting more from what our work is. And the things that will make us performant are going to come more from our sense of intrinsic yearning, motivation, meaning, and less from the sort of external reward system or threat system or anything like that. I hope, I dream, I pray that that's the way this goes.
Great. That sounds like a really nice place to end, or at least pause the discussion for now. I want to thank all three of you for a really informative and open and provocative discussion. I want to thank everyone in the audience for listening and for participating. We'll send out a recording of this. If anyone has any questions that we didn't get to answer, please send it to us via the provided links. We'll try to answer them in the follow-up email. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we're looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks specifically to Jonathan, Bhaskar, and Rachel. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Bye-bye.